Oh, somebody's joining me. Oh, there we go. Starting to get some people joining me. Feel free to say hi in the chat. Once I get a few people here, then I will start talking about my take on the budget. So while we're waiting, if you want, you can say hi or whatever. This doesn't show me who's joining, just says there are 3 of us here. So we'll get started in a few minutes. Thanks for joining, though. Hey, Idris. Thanks for joining. Hope I said your name right. All right. Okay, you're one of my... Nice, awesome. Well, I don't know anybody else named Idris, although isn't there an actor named Idris Elba? I think it's the same spelling, so maybe that's how I knew how to spell it. Cool, well, either way, thanks for joining me. So today I'm going to be discussing the Alberta budget that was just released last week, and my take on it. I don't know if everybody is familiar with the story. Actually, maybe I should post it. I don't know if I can edit. Oh, here it is. There we go. There, I put it into the description so people can read it if they want to follow along. So I guess just me and Idris at the moment. Just tying up a couple of loose ends here before we get into it. All right, so yeah, so let's get into it then. Okay, so last week the Alberta government released their budget, their provincial budget, and some of the rhetoric they used was pretty interesting, and although not surprising. I've seen some of the media talk about it as being a what's the word? Stay the course kind of a budget. There isn't a whole lot of changes and stuff, but I mean, that's only a positive thing if the course was, if they weren't already on course for cutting services and reducing how much they're spending in general on public services. So staying the course isn't necessarily a positive thing. Some of the other rhetoric that they were using was how Budget 2021 is going to pave the way for growth in Alberta's post-pandemic economy with significant infrastructure spending that positions the province for growth and creates jobs. Now, I mean, that's good in general. I appreciate when governments spend money on infrastructure because it does stimulate the economy. The only problem is that often their infrastructure spending is on maintenance things. Like the vast majority of their $10 billion they spent on capital infrastructure in the last budget was on maintenance, like upgrading heating systems and fixing potholes on highways and things like that, which are important things, but it's misleading to make people think that that's what you're going to be spending on new roads and new buildings, new schools. And even then, even if you were building new schools and other public infrastructure, unless you hire new workers to be able to staff those schools or provide those services, then it's almost kind of pointless. So yeah, so they're planning on investing $21 billion in construction projects to support approximately 90,000 new jobs. And again, even that rhetoric is kind of iffy because these aren't going to be 90,000 new jobs. Here's the thing with construction is that construction jobs aren't really new jobs. The way, as somebody who has worked in construction, is the way that it works is you work on a project. When you're done with the project, you go to work on another project. But on paper, that looks like two jobs. Like, even though you're the same person working both jobs, it looks like two jobs. I worked on, when I was working shortly after I graduated high school, I worked in construction for about a year or so, and I worked on several projects. But on paper, it would have looked like I was three different people working, even though I was the same person. And that's the way construction works. You work on a project, you're done, you move on to the next project. And so these aren't necessarily going to be 90,000 new jobs. Some of them, I'm sure, will be new jobs. These are going to be, they're going to employ people who have never worked in construction before, so no doubt. But the vast majority, I would predict, are going to be people who are already working in construction, and they'll just be tying up one construction job and then moving on to another construction job. But even so, it'll be interesting to see what exactly they have in mind with these construction projects. What do they mean by $21 billion in construction projects? Are they going to be actual projects, or are they just going to be maintenance projects? Like I said, like filling in potholes, or repaving roads, or refurbishing bridges, which are all important infrastructure to take care of. But unless it's brand new infrastructure, it's not going to be that meaningful. Like, unless you twin highways, you're not going to improve the usability of a highway. It's one thing to fill in potholes. It's quite another thing it's one thing to fill in potholes along the Crow's Nest Highway between Tabor and Medicine Hat. It's quite another thing to twin it all the way, right? So, yeah, and then maintaining responsible spending. Like, what does responsible even mean? Taking a careful approach to spending. What does careful? What does careful spending mean? What does responsible spending mean? Those things are meaningless. They're just dog whistles for conservative supporters. All it means is that we're not going to be spending very much. It doesn't mean we're going to be responsible in that we're going to increase our revenue in order to match our spending. What it means is we're going to reduce our spending to match the low amount of revenue that's in place because we cut taxes. So that's what responsible spending and careful approach to spending are referring to, is the fact it's always about cutting spending. And cutting spending always comes down to cutting jobs, because that's what we spend the vast majority on tax revenue on is jobs. The vast majority of the money the government spends goes to pay for the people who are providing those services. So any cut in spending means cut in public sector jobs. Okay, so that's kind of the basic rhetoric that the budget is using. As far as my coverage of it, there are just a few highlights that I wanted to discuss. So, like, one of the things in 2019, the UCP promised that they were going to give Alberta a budget surplus of $714 million by the time the next election rolled around. And then they were going to increase the total deficit for all 4 years of the first term to only $86 billion. Well, obviously, that's not going to be the case. And of course, granted, the pandemic happened and low oil prices happened. But here's the thing, though. Specifically to oil prices, you have to understand that oil prices are volatile. They are not dependable. You cannot budget your provincial budget based on oil prices being sky high, because anything can happen. You cannot control. The Alberta government does not control the oil prices. They are at the mercy of the market, and at the mercy of much larger producers, much more influential producers. And so you can't run a budget depending on high oil prices. And so the fact that they're saying low oil prices last January and February prevented us from being able to have a proper budget is just a cop-out, because you can't depend on high oil prices. That's a ridiculous way to be able to run a budget. Now, again, granted, the pandemic is something that was uncontrollable. But there were components to the budget that could have mitigated the effects of the pandemic, like not cutting corporate income tax. So we went from personal income tax making up about 75% of the total income tax revenue that the government of Alberta takes in, to this year being about 85%. So we lost hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate income tax revenue by cutting it from 12% down to 8%. And that's just irresponsible, especially in the middle of a pandemic. It's one thing to do it in July 2019, or even in January 2019. So they went in July 2019, they went from 12% to 11%. And then the following January, they went from 10% to 8%, or to 10%, from 11% to 10%. And that's one thing. But then to do it again in the pandemic, to go from, they were planning on going from 10% to 9% last July, but then changed it from 10% to 8% in the middle of a pandemic when the economy isn't doing that great, and when the government should be spending money. And if they're worried about a deficit, then they shouldn't be cutting revenue, because if they're going to be spending money in order to stimulate the economy, they can mitigate that spending by not cutting their revenue. It was an irresponsible thing to do. And so, yes, the pandemic did have a big effect on the budget, a big effect on how much they had to borrow, a big effect on the deficit and the debt load, but it didn't have to be as high as it is. They could have reduced how much it was going to be. So, and on that note, first thing I want to talk about is the provincial debt. So, this budget predicts that by the end of this new budget year, the end of March 2022, the provincial debt is going to be $115.8 billion. This is the first time in decades, if not ever. I was only able to go back for 2 or 3 decades to find the information, but I could not find any evidence that the debt had ever gone over $100 billion before. So as far as I can tell, this is the first time in decades, if not ever, that Alberta's debt has ever passed $100 billion. And final numbers of the provincial debt for this current budget year, which doesn't end until the end of this month, have yet to come in because, well, it's still ongoing. But the province is forecasting $98.3 billion by the end of this month. So it's potentially, it could go a little bit higher or come in for a little bit lower, just depending on how things work out. But it's still roughly $100 billion. When they announced last year's budget, last February, the government had predicted that taxpayer-supported debt for this current budget year, which again ends at the end of this month, was going to be $76.9 billion. And then increased it in August by over $20 billion to 99.6. And then last November, when they did the mid-year update, they dropped it down to $97.4 billion. But we're still going to be ended up with $20 billion more in debt than we had originally were told a year ago. And of course, a lot of that is because of the pandemic. But like I said, a lot of it is also from cutting corporate taxes and then relying so much on high oil prices, which is funny because oil revenues make up such a small portion of the provincial budget, less than 10%, which I'll get into in a little bit. Again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to post it in the chat and I'll be able to answer them. I'd be happy to answer them if you have any. Let's see. So we are forecasted to be at $97.4 billion at the end of this budget year. And then at the end of the previous fiscal year, we ended with $74.1 billion. That's before the pandemic, or rather at the start, barely at the start of the pandemic, which $74.1 billion, which was higher than they had originally forecasted at $67.9 billion. The total amount of taxpayer-supported debt had reached $62.7 billion at the end of NDP's term at the end of 2019. So what that means is that after 3 years in power, the UCP will have increased the debt of the province by 85% over what the NDP had built it to when they left office. And keep in mind that the NDP also had a recession in 2015, 2016. they were dealing with the recession as well as low oil prices. Now, oil prices didn't get as low with the NDP as they did under the UCP a little over a year ago. And the pandemic was significantly harder on the economy than the recession was. But nevertheless, it's not like the NDP were spending money and with a great economy. They had to deal with financial difficulties as well in the economy. So again, the UCP are going to increase the debt by 85% over what the NDP had already built it to. Let's see, what else did I talk about in my article? Yeah, and so by the time, even after the first round of cuts in the autumn of 2019, the UCP had already increased the debt by nearly $12 billion in just their first year. So that's like before the pandemic even happened. That's before any adjustments. That's just after they released their first budget, how much they were going to be spending by. So $12 billion before the pandemic, before the low oil prices, $12 billion. So basically a 25% increase over what the debt already was. Okay, and if you that's just taxpayer supported debt. If you include self-supporting lending organization activity debt, it actually goes from it goes to $146 billion, nearly $150 billion in debt. And the cost to service our provincial debt over the next year, so during this next budget year, is going to be $2.3 billion in taxpayer support. And that's higher than the $1.96 billion forecasted for the current budget year. And then by the next budget year, so the year leading up to the next election, it's going to be over $2.6 billion, nearly $2.7 billion. We'll be spending more in paying back the debt than we'll be spending on operating expenses for every one of the government ministries except for 4, which is advanced education, community and social services, education, and health. So it's going to be costing us more to pay off, to make payments on our debts than it will be to run these programs. And again, that's partly because they're cutting services and cutting revenue. If we had more revenue, that wouldn't be as much of an issue. And it's just this cyclical thing, because not only that, but the fact that we're cutting revenue means we have to borrow more money in order to pay our expenses. So it's just this snowball effect. Okay. Yeah, and during the last budget year of the NDP, their taxpayer supported debt servicing costs were $1.527 billion. So it costs less to pay towards provincial debt under the NDP than it did the USP, which makes sense because the debt is higher under the USP, so it's going to cost more to pay it off. Just like if you keep increasing your credit card balance, then your minimum monthly payments are going to go up the same way, right? So it's basically the same thing. The higher your debt, the higher your payments, your monthly payments are going to be, or however often they make their payments. I'm not sure how often they make their payments. So in addition, one final thing regarding debt before we start getting into deficit, revenue, expenses, and jobs, is that during the another thing that's increasing is the net debt to GDP ratio. So how much debt we have compared to how well the GDP is performing. Hey, we have 4 participants now. Wow, it's jumped up to 4. We were 3 and 2. Now we have 4. So welcome, everybody. Just letting you know that if you have any questions and anything I'm saying, or you have anything about the budget to say, feel free to pop into the chat and let me know, and I'll try and say something about it. Okay, so I'm just in the middle of wrapping up talking about the debt portion of the budget, and just talking about net debt to GDP ratio. And so the net debt to GDP ratio for the 2021-2022 budget is estimated at 24.5%, which is more than the 20.3% that they were forecasting for the current budget year, which ends this month. and significantly higher than the 12.1% that they had originally budgeted last February. And it's going to keep rising. So the next budget year, the last budget year leading up to the election, it's going to be 26.1%. And if they get reelected, then their first year in the second term, it's going to be 26.6%. The net debt to GDP ratio was only 8% under the NDP's last budget. So under the NDP, the net debt to GDP ratio over the first year was minus 1.2%. Then it was 2.8%. Then it was 5.8%. Then it was 11.4%. And then with the UCP, it's 20.3%, 24.5%, 26.1%, 26.6%. So you can see where we're going with this. So not only is debt going up, oh, now we have 5 participants. Welcome, everybody. Not only is debt going up, but debt is increasing at a higher rate than our GDP is. So our debt to GDP ratio is widening. It's going to take more of the more producing in the economy in order for the government to be able to pay off that debt. Anyhow, so that's it about debt. Unless anybody had some comments or questions about that, I'm gonna have a drink of water and then I'll just move into the deficit. All right, so welcome everybody who's been joining us. I'm going in almost 30 minutes, and I'm basically talking about my news article I wrote, I think on Monday, regarding the Alberta provincial budget for 2021-2022. I just finished talking about the debt portion, and now I'm going to be talking about deficit. If you are just joining me, feel free to chat, introduce yourself. It doesn't tell me who's watching. It just says the number of participants. It doesn't show me anybody's names. So feel free to introduce yourself or to ask me any questions. Oh, now we have 7 people. So welcome everybody. All right, so that was the debt. Now on to the deficit. So over this next year, so starting in April until next March, the provincial government is predicting that we will have an $18.2 billion deficit. So they're forecasting $20.2 billion deficit this year. So that's going to come in at a much smaller deficit than we currently have. Excuse me. So that, keep in mind though, that the government predicted last February that the deficit for this current year was going to be only $6.8 billion. So while next year's deficit may end up lower than this year's, it's still going to be nearly 3 times what this year's was supposed to be. And they're also forecasting deficits for every one of their 4 years in power. In fact, every one of their deficits is expected to come in higher than the highest deficit under the NDP. So the NDP had deficits every one of their 4 years. Their first year was 6.44 billion. The next year was 10.78 billion. The next one was 8.02 billion. And the last year was 6.71 billion. And then the UCP, 12.15 billion, their first year, 20.19 billion in their next year, this current year, 18.22 billion in this upcoming year, and then 10.98 billion in their last year right before the next election. So the NDP had a total of $31.95 billion in deficits, and the UCP is forecasted for $61.54 billion in deficits. So almost twice as much. The NDP, twice as much would have been, let's see, just do a quick calculation. Twice as much would have been $63.9 billion, and the UCP is coming in at $61.5 billion. So almost twice as much in total deficits over 4 years compared to the NDP's 4 years. So that's a lot. So they're going to be doubling the debt compared to how much the NDP had increased it by. So while revenue will be up next year by $1.4 billion over this year's forecast, it's still going to be $6.3 billion less than what was originally forecasted last year. $2.5 billion less than what the UCP brought in their first year, and $5.9 billion less than what the NDP brought in during their final year. So, I mean, that's why we're going to have so much deficits, because we're not bringing in as much revenue as they had originally hoped for, or and how much, or compared to how much the NDP had brought in, which means it's time to go into the revenue portion of the discussion. So revenue is down. It's down as of last year's initial forecast, down from actual revenue in 2019, 2020, and down from actual revenue in 2018, 2019, like I already just talked about. And this isn't that surprising, given that they have, like I said at the beginning, they focus so much on oil prices. And if oil prices are low and you are planning a budget based on high oil prices, then you're going to have low revenue. Plus, we also cut taxes, the corporate tax rates, and that's a source of revenue. And so if you're going to cut your revenue, your revenue is going to be lower. Okay, so as far as revenue sources go, there are 8 different areas. So there's income taxes, other taxes, non-renewable oil resources, so that's like oil royalties and stuff like that, transfer from the federal government, investment income, business enterprises, so that's like money they get from crown corporations, premiums, fees, licenses, that sort of thing, and then other, whatever that is. And in every revenue source except for 2, we're forecasted to be higher by next March than what they had predicted for this March. The 2 revenue sources expected to decrease are transfer payments from the federal government and investment income. However, nearly all revenue forecasts are going to be lower than they were in the UCP's first year. Federal transfers, business enterprises, and premiums and fees should still be higher than in 2019. So even though federal transfers will be lower this year this upcoming year compared to this past year, they're still going to be lower than they were the first budget that the UCP released. In addition, premiums and fees are going to be going up. So even though we pay less in taxes on paper, we're going to be paying more in premiums and fees and the various public services that okay, here's a breakdown by revenue of total percent. Here's a breakdown of revenue by percentage of total revenue. So this next year, income taxes are going to make up 43.63% of total government revenue. Federal transfers from Ottawa are going to make up 23.3%. So together, they're going to make up basically 67%. 2/3 of government revenues are going to come from income taxes and federal transfers. The next highest amount is premiums, fees, and licenses, and that's at basically 9.5%. Other is 7.74%. Investment incomes 5.05%. Business enterprises 4.3%. Other taxes 3.39%. And at the bottom of the barrel is non-renewable resource revenue at 3.14%. So barely over 3% of government revenue is going to come from oil and gas industry. So almost 97% of the government's revenue is going to come from outside oil and gas. And so I don't understand why we keep putting so much emphasis on high oil prices as a way to balance our budgets, because it makes up such a small portion of our budget. So in comparison, federal transfers under the NDP were 16.15%, and now they're going to be 23.3%. Premiums, fees, and licenses made up 7.9% of the budget revenue under the NDP. And this upcoming year, they're going to be 9.5%. Investment income is up from 4.7% to 5.1%. Business enterprises is down from 5.2% to 4.3%. Non-renewable resources under the NDP were 4.5%. So we're going from 4.5% down to 3.1%. And last year, they were at 2.1% of total revenues. And the first year under the UCP, it was 4%. So every one of the last 3 years under the UCP government, it's been less than the 4.5% that it was under the NDP's last year. So even though federal transfers are forecasted to decrease over the next 3 years, so they're going from 9.36% down to 9.46%, then 8.91%, and then finally 8.53%. They are still going to be making up between 20 and 23% of all provincial revenue. Oh, sorry, I read those wrong. It's going to go from 26.91% down to 23.3%, then 20.82%, then 19.24%. And so even though it's still going to be decreasing, they're still going to be making up between 20 and 23% of all provincial revenue. Which still going to make it the second largest source of revenue for the Alberta government. Income tax and money from Ottawa combined, like I said, will make up about 2 out of every 3 revenue dollars. Okay, and despite dropping $4.2 billion, income tax revenue is still going to make up over 2/5 of government revenue in the 2020-2021 fiscal year. And like I said earlier, right at the beginning, 86% of that will come from personal income tax. And which makes sense since the UCP cut the corporate tax rate by 1/3. So total income tax revenue is going to be 13.538%. And only $13.538 billion, and only $1.891 billion of that is coming from corporate income tax. The vast majority of it will be coming from personal income tax. Let's see what else we got here. It's going to make up 6 times as much provincial revenue as corporate income tax over the next year. And pandemic has a lot to do with that. If companies are shut down, they're not making money, they're not going to be making profits, so they're going to be paying less in income tax. But at the same time, they did cut the corporate income tax rate by 1/3. They went from 12% down to 8%. So that's going to be a big chunk too. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay, so that's pretty much it for revenue. Now onto expenses. We're getting close to the end. We're more than halfway through. The government's going to be increasing the operating expense budget by $1 billion. I'm not going to go into what that looks like for each ministry. You can check the link in the description so you can see it yourself. But what we do find out is that compared to last year, there are 10 ministries with higher forecasted operating expenses and 8 with lower forecasts. But if we compare the new budget to the NDP's last budget, only 5 ministries are getting more money, not 10. So Children's Services is getting $225 million compared to 2018-2019. Community and Social Services, $252 million. Education, $25 million more dollars. Health, $1.009 billion. And seniors and housing, $43 million more operating dollars. So I want to touch on the health spending because that sounds like a lot, like over $1 billion in health spending. And I've seen UCP politicians using this talking point, in particular Jason Kenney. So $1.009 billion seems like a lot of money, but health spending is the largest operating expense within the provincial government. And so $1.009 billion is actually only 4.9% of what we had previously been spending. So it's not a large increase. It's less than a 5% increase, roughly a 5% increase. And this means an average, and remember, that's since the 2018-2019 budget. So that's spread out over 3 years, which means an average of 1.6% increase each one of those years. So 4.9% increase over 3 years and an average of 1.6% every year. So that's nothing. That's less than 2%. Keep in mind that population growth has averaged 1.28% each year between the end of 2018 and the end of 2019. So population growth is 1.28%. The health budget went up 1.6%. So we went from basically 1.3% to 1.6%. Population growth alone is almost eating up that entire increase. And then inflation averaged 1.7% every year between 2018 and 2020. So now we have a health spending increase of 1.6%, And then we have a population growth increase of 1.28% and annual inflation average growth of 1.74%. So right there, it shows us that this 1.6% increase of health spending every year isn't enough to cover both population growth and inflation. It's just not. And so even though we're spending over $1 billion more, it's not even enough to be able to adequately cover the capacity that Alberta needs as it grows. And as it grows, the number of people it has to serve, and as it tries to accommodate the increase in the costs of things, the increase of wages, the increase of suppliers, the cost of supplies from external suppliers, whether that's, pens or light bulbs or gowns or PPEs or gauze or instruments or whatever it happens to be. Like, all these things cost money, more money every year. And if you don't account for that, then you're effectively doing a cut. And on that note, if the UCP had been keeping up with population and inflation growth, we'd be seeing them spending $22.3 billion over the next year for health. And by failing to keep up with population and inflation growth, the UCP are effectively cutting health spending by nearly $1 billion. So they're saying that they are spending over $1 billion over a 3-year period since 2018, 2019. But in fact, because they're not keeping up with population and inflation, they are cutting health spending by nearly $1 billion just in this year alone. Anyhow, outside of just health, the largest cuts to the 2021-2022 budget are going to be in 4 ministries. Environment and Parks is losing $145 million in spending, operational spending. Advanced Education is losing $75 million in operational spending. Justice Ministry and the Solicitor General are losing $64 million in operational spending. And the Infrastructure Ministry is losing $42 million in operational spending. And if we compare the ministry's spending amounts to spending in 2018, 2019, at the end of the NDP's term, the largest cuts are even worse. So between 2018, 2019, and by the end of this next budget year, the Finance Ministry and Treasury Board are going to lose over $500 million. Advanced education, so universities, colleges, post-secondary, $348 million are going to lose in spending. Agriculture and forestry, $128 million. And environment and parks are going to go from $145 million to only $125 million. So they're actually technically a bit better off, but it's still going to lose $120 million. So are they really better off? And so with all these cuts in spending, of course, we have to talk about jobs. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. And then we're almost at the end. I was worried if I was going to have enough content to talk about for an hour, and here we are, just about 45 minutes. So since human resources makes up such a large portion of operational expenses, it's not surprising that there's going to be a reduction in jobs. Now, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. The government, according to their budget, plans to add 1,873 full-time equivalent positions in 2021, 2022. So that sounds impressive, right? Almost 2,000 new jobs. So that sounds great for the public sector. 208,601 public sector positions next year. This current year, the government was employing 206,728. So we're going to go from 206,728 to 208,601. So almost 2,000 more jobs. Well, 1,873. However, at the end of the NDP's last term, or at the end of the NDP's term, since we've had only one so far, Alberta's public sector was employing 210,407 workers. So this upcoming year's increase is barely half of the workforce that the UCP cut over the last 2 years. So yeah, great. We're going to hire 1,873 new workers, but we cut almost 4,000 workers. So We're not really that much better off. Anyhow, so there are only 10 areas in the public sector, not necessarily 10 ministries, but 10 areas where there will see job increases. And most of those job increases are going to be in Alberta Health Services. So Alberta Health Services is going to get almost 3,000 new jobs, 2,940 jobs. Environment and Parks Ministry is going to get 68 new jobs, which is weird. How are they going to get 68 jobs when they're going to be cutting $145 million from the budget? They're going to have $145 million less to spend on operational expenses, but somehow they're going to be hiring 68 new people? That makes no sense. Anyhow, Alberta Investment Management Corporation is going to get 49. The Energy Ministry is going to get 19. Alberta Pension Services Corporation is going to get 19 new jobs. Municipal Affairs Ministry is 14 new jobs. Labor and Immigration, 10 new jobs. Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, 6 new jobs. Alberta Enterprise Corporation, 2 new jobs. And the Executive Council, 2 new jobs. Executive Council is basically the staffers who support Jason Kenney, who support the UCP ministers, the cabinet. And so they, I guess, are going to hire 2 more staffers. So that's kind of interesting. I noticed people are coming and going as watching this. So if you're interested in seeing what we're talking about, there's a link in the description that should take you to the news article I wrote on Monday regarding the Alberta provincial budget. So like I said, the vast majority of those increases are going to be with Alberta Health Services. And my guess is that most of those are going to be related to the pandemic response. So continuing to do testing, continuing to healthcare workers responding and taking care of those affected by COVID. But in addition, as vaccines start to roll out, then that's healthcare workers rolling out that vaccine. So I anticipate that if COVID is over by the end of this next budget year, we could see a chunk of those 1,800 positions lost in the last budget for the UCP government. Now, so those are the jobs that are going to see increases. And so since we're going to see a net increase of 1,873 jobs, and Alberta Health Services alone is going to see 2,940 jobs, that means there's going to be a bunch of jobs cut. And here are the 10 areas that will see the largest job cuts. So I'll start at so post-secondary institutions are going to lose 750 positions this next year, full-time equivalent positions over this next year. 750 jobs from universities and colleges. That's in addition to the jobs they've already gotten rid of. Infrastructure Ministry is going to lose 72 jobs. Justice Ministry is going to lose 71. Agriculture and Forestry Ministry is going to lose 70, which isn't that surprising since they are going to be losing $128 million in operational spending since the 2018-2019 budget. Transportation Ministry is going to lose 58. Service Alberta is going to lose 44. Can you imagine? Service Alberta, the ministry that's responsible for delivering services to the public, it's going to lose 44 workers. It's going to be harder to take advantage of services for citizens. It's mind-boggling. Energy Efficiency Alberta, losing 27 positions. Indigenous Relations Ministry, losing 26 positions. So the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation is going to get 6 new positions, but the Indigenous Relations Ministry is going to lose 26 positions. Agricultural Financial Services Corporation is going to lose 21 positions. For farmers, financial services for farmers, 21 positions are going to lose. Community and social services are going to lose 21. And that makes no sense either because they're increasing operational spending by nearly $90 million. So this makes no sense. Environment and Parks are going to increase their number of workers by 68, even though they are losing $145 million in spending. But Children's Services, or was it Children's Services? No, Community and Social Services, they're increasing their spending by $225 million, yet they're losing 21 workers. This makes, I mean, it's probably going to be a bunch of grants, probably one-time grants and stuff like that, but still, it's so mind-boggling. Anyhow, that's jobs. Like I said, spending cuts end up being job cuts. And every one of those job cuts is going to affect the services that the public consumes. That could be anything from inspections to, phone help or whatever it happens to be. Okay, so this year, the last thing I want to talk about, and just briefly, is borrowing. This year, the UCP plans to borrow slightly more than $24 billion over the next year. Over the last 2 years, they've already borrowed $30 billion. They plan to borrow an additional $18.7 billion in the final year of this term, so the last budget year right before the election, and $12.9 billion the following year if they are reelected. Of that $28.465 billion, only $5.045 billion of it appears to be going to capital projects. And then the government also plans to use $12.49 billion of it to finance the fiscal plan. So not even half of it is going to go to the fiscal plan. So in summary, $43.7 billion in revenue, $61.9 billion in expenses for an $18.2 billion deficit. In their 2019 election platform, may I remind my viewers, the UC promised to maintain operating spending at current levels as part of a realistic plan to balance the budget by 2022-23 without compromising core services. In the same platform, they anticipated $54.72 billion in revenue and $57.96 billion in expenses for this next year for a $3.94 billion deficit. Instead, they got $43.7 billion in revenue, $61.9 billion in expenses, and an $18.2 billion deficit. 6 times the deficit they had originally planned when they were campaigning to be elected. Their goal to see a $714 million surplus by the next provincial election, using what they called cautious lower revenue projections provided by Stokes Economics, an economics consulting firm, seems to be drifting further and further away. So that's my take on the Alberta budget. Any questions? What did y'all think of my first YouTube Live? I've never done a YouTube Live video, so I went better than I expected. I thought I wouldn't have very much to talk about, but it was a pretty long article, so there's quite a bit to talk about there. So what do you think? Did you have any questions? Any comments that you want to share? Any thoughts about the budget that you had yourself? Let me know in the comments. Oh, thanks, Nadia. I appreciate it. I appreciate the comment, and thanks for joining in. I hope you found it fascinating. Yeah, I totally agree. This is really frightening. There is a lot to discuss there, and it's a frightening budget. And I'm worried what the next budget's going to be like. If we get this pandemic under control and things are back to normal for next year, I'm afraid of what that budget's going to look like. They're not going to have the pandemic to look forward. Thanks, Gareth. Appreciate you stopping by and watching the video. Hope you found it useful. Now I can see participants. Must be participants. Whoever comments shows up as a participant. That's cool. Agreed. Yeah, totally. Cool. Well, thanks everybody. I might do another one of these, just depending on, maybe I can talk about some of my other articles that I've talked about during the week. So thanks for stopping by. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate the feedback. And look forward to talking to you again soon. See you all on social media. Solidarity.